Across medieval Europe, dragons appeared in stories, carvings, manuscripts, and sermons, with such consistency that people from England to Scandinavia could recognize the creature instantly, despite differences in language and culture. These dragons were rarely described as random beasts, because medieval writers treated them as symbols shaped by theology, moral teaching, and shared fears about disorder in the world. In Christian Europe, dragons often represented sin or chaos, drawing imagery from earlier biblical references such as the serpent of Eden and the great dragon of Revelation. Monks copying illuminated manuscripts included dragons not merely as decoration, but as visual reminders that moral struggle existed everywhere, even in distant lands. Chronicles recorded encounters with strange serpents along rivers, forests, and coastlines, blending observation with allegory in ways that made it difficult to separate history from teaching. Medieval audiences did not always interpret dragons literally, yet neither did they dismiss them entirely as fiction, because the natural world was believed to contain hidden wonders. Travelers' tales described enormous reptiles or winged serpents glimpsed briefly before disappearing into marshes or caves, reinforcing the sense that dragons might exist at the edges of known geography. These stories circulated widely through sermons and oral tradition, shaping how communities imagined danger and divine testing. Artists depicted dragons with elongated bodies, clawed feet, and fierce eyes, creating a visual language that remained surprisingly consistent across regions. The repetition of these forms suggests that dragons functioned less as individual creatures and more as moral archetypes, recognizable at a glance. In medieval theology, chaos was often imagined as something external that threatened the ordered world established by divine authority. Dragons embodied that chaos visually, giving people a way to understand abstract spiritual struggles through concrete imagery. Knights and saints confronting dragons in stories symbolized a triumph of faith, discipline, or humility over forces that disrupted moral balance. These narratives did not always emphasize physical combat, because the dragon often represented an internal struggle projected outward into the landscape. Hagiographies described saints calming or banishing dragons through prayer, reinforcing the idea that spiritual authority mattered more than physical strength. The widespread nature of dragon imagery reveals how interconnected medieval storytelling traditions were despite geographic distance. Scandinavia preserved older serpent motifs rooted in Norse mythology, while Western Europe blended those images with Christian symbolism. Carved dragon heads on ships and church architecture served as both protective symbols and reminders of the boundary between order and chaos. Chronicles sometimes recorded unusual natural events such as large snakes, fossil discoveries, or unfamiliar animals using language that echoed dragon imagery. These descriptions show how medieval observers interpreted the unknown through familiar symbolic frameworks, rather than purely scientific categories. The presence of dragons in maps and bestiaries reinforced the belief that distant regions contained dangers requiring spiritual readiness. Mapmakers often placed dragons at the edges of known territory, marking places where moral and physical uncertainty overlapped. This placement did not necessarily indicate fear of exploration, but rather recognition that the world remained partially mysterious. Sermons used dragon imagery to teach lessons about pride, temptation, and perseverance, linking everyday struggles to epic narratives. Listeners understood that slaying a dragon symbolized overcoming inner faults as much as defeating an external enemy. Medieval audiences were accustomed to layered storytelling, in which historical events and symbolic meaning existed simultaneously. The dragon therefore became a bridge between religious teaching and popular imagination, allowing complex ideas to be communicated visually and emotionally. Pilgrims traveling between regions carried stories with them, spreading dragon legends across Europe and reinforcing shared cultural themes. Illuminated manuscripts reveal that artists adapted dragon forms creatively while maintaining recognizable features that audiences expected. This consistency suggests that dragons functioned as a cultural language understood across political boundaries. Even when chronicles described dragon sightings as real events, they often framed them within a moral context rather than a purely natural explanation. The boundary between observation and allegory remained fluid, reflecting a worldview in which spiritual meaning shaped interpretation of the natural world. Medieval people lived in landscapes filled with uncertainty, and dragon stories provided a framework for confronting fear without surrendering hope. These narratives encouraged listeners to view adversity as a test rather than a random occurrence. The enduring popularity of dragons reveals how powerfully symbolic creatures could unify diverse cultures around shared moral lessons. Over time, dragon imagery evolved alongside changing religious and political contexts, adapting to new audiences while retaining its core symbolism. The creature's presence in both sacred and secular art demonstrates its versatility as a moral and cultural icon. Understanding medieval dragons, therefore, requires seeing them not as failed attempts at zoology, but as expressions of belief shaped by history and imagination. The stories preserved in chronicles and art offer insight into how people understood the world's dangers through narrative rather than empirical explanation. Dragons were drawn into history not simply as monsters to be feared, but as warnings that transformed moral struggle into something visible and unforgettable. In medieval storytelling, the act of slaying a dragon rarely functioned as a simple tale of combat, because audiences understood the confrontation as a visible expression of spiritual struggle. Knights facing dragons represented disciplined individuals, confronting forces believed to threaten both the soul and the stability of society. These stories circulated widely through romances, sermons, and illuminated manuscripts, reinforcing a shared image of moral courage shaped by religious ideals. The figure of St. George became one of the most recognizable dragon slayers, not because he embodied violence, but because his victory symbolized faith overcoming chaos. Artists depicted George's lance piercing the dragon while townspeople watched, emphasizing the communal significance of spiritual triumph. In many versions of the story, the dragon terrorized a community until humility and prayer transformed fear into resolution. This narrative structure taught listeners that evil could be confronted through steadfastness rather than brute force alone. Medieval knights often interpreted dragon-slaying imagery as a metaphor for resisting temptation, pride, or disorder within themselves. Armor and weapons in these stories symbolized discipline, suggesting that moral preparation mattered as much as physical strength. Chivalric literature expanded the motif, portraying knights who encountered dragons during quests that tested their loyalty and restraint. These encounters rarely ended with celebration of destruction, but instead emphasized restoration of balance and protection of the innocent. Church sermons reinforced this interpretation by comparing dragons to spiritual adversaries described in Scripture. Monastic writers described the dragon as a creature that fed on disorder, using vivid imagery to communicate lessons about vigilance and humility. In some legends, saints did not kill dragons, but tamed or banished them, illustrating the power of spiritual authority over chaos. This variation reveals that medieval audiences valued transformation as much as conquest when interpreting dragon stories. Knights in illuminated manuscripts were often shown calm and composed rather than enraged, reinforcing the idea that moral clarity guided their actions. The presence of witnesses in these scenes suggests that dragon slaying served as a public lesson rather than a private triumph. Chronicles occasionally describe rulers comparing their victories over enemies to dragon slaying, blending political propaganda with spiritual symbolism. Such comparisons reveal how deeply the dragon motif penetrated medieval imagination, shaping how power and virtue were represented visually. The dragon's defeat often coincided with conversion narratives, linking spiritual awakening to the restoration of social order. Stories told in marketplaces and courts spread these themes beyond monastic settings, allowing common audiences to engage with complex moral ideas through dramatic imagery. Sculptures on cathedral doors portrayed dragons coiled beneath saints' feet, reminding worshippers of the ongoing struggle between sin and redemption. Even secular talis adopted the motif, presenting dragon slaying as proof of courage tempered by wisdom. The repetition of these stories across regions suggests that dragon imagery functioned as a shared cultural language bridging different communities. Scandinavian sagas incorporated serpent battles that echoed earlier mythological traditions while aligning with emerging Christian symbolism. French and English romances adapted dragon tales to emphasize knightly virtue, shaping ideals of honor that influenced social behavior. Eastern European chronicles described encounters with monstrous serpents along rivers, blending local folklore with broader European motifs. These regional variations demonstrate how flexible the dragon symbol became as it traveled across cultural boundaries. Listeners understood that dragons were not merely enemies to be defeated, but tests revealing the character of those who faced them. This interpretation encouraged audiences to view hardship as an opportunity for growth rather than a sign of divine punishment. Visual depictions of dragon battles often included serene landscapes, suggesting that victory restored harmony rather than celebrating destruction. Medieval artists balanced fearsome imagery with calm composition, reinforcing the lesson that order ultimately prevailed. The enduring popularity of dragon-slaying stories reveals how powerfully narrative shaped medieval ethics and social ideals. Knights were expected to embody virtues such as patience, humility, and protection of the weak, qualities symbolized through encounters with dragons. Over time, the dragon motif became so widespread that it influenced heraldry, literature, and even festival traditions. The creature's presence in both sacred and secular contexts demonstrates its role as a bridge between religious teaching and popular imagination. By framing moral struggle as a visible battle, dragon stories allowed audiences to grasp abstract theological concepts through vivid imagery. The lessons embedded within these tales endured long after medieval society changed, shaping later interpretations of heroism and virtue. Understanding dragon-slaying narratives therefore reveals how medieval people interpreted conflict not simply as physical violence but as an expression of spiritual meaning. The knight confronting the dragon became a symbol of disciplined humanity facing the uncertainties of a world where faith and fear were inseparable. Medieval chronicles sometimes recorded encounters with enormous serpents or dragon-like creatures in language that blended observation, symbolism, and moral interpretation. Writers rarely separated natural description from spiritual meaning, because unusual animals were believed to reveal lessons about divine order and human behavior. Reports of giant snakes near rivers or marshes appeared in English, French, and Eastern European records, often framed as warnings rather than curiosities. Chroniclers described witnesses seeing scaled bodies moving through water or coiled beneath cliffs, using vocabulary drawn from both scripture and folklore. These accounts were not always intended as literal zoological documentation, yet neither were they dismissed as pure invention. Medieval audiences lived in landscapes where unfamiliar animals, fossils, and exaggerated travelers' tales could silently merge into believable narratives. The discovery of large bones in fields or caves sometimes inspired speculation that dragons had once existed. Beyond chronicles and spoken stories, dragons appeared everywhere in medieval Europe's visual culture, carved into church doors, painted in manuscripts, and woven into the borders of sacred texts. Artists treated dragons as recognizable symbols that conveyed moral meaning instantly to viewers who might never read the written words surrounding them. Cathedral sculptures often depicted saints standing calmly over coiled dragons, emphasizing spiritual victory through posture rather than dramatic action. These carvings functioned as silent sermons, reminding worshippers entering sacred spaces that moral struggle accompanied everyday life. Illuminated manuscripts used dragons to frame biblical scenes, blending narrative decoration with theological instruction. The repetition of dragon imagery across monasteries suggests a shared artistic vocabulary shaped by religious teaching and cultural memory. Dragons were not confined to religious contexts, appearing also in heraldry where noble families adopted them as emblems of strength, vigilance, or lineage. Heraldic dragons varied in form, sometimes winged and serpentine, sometimes stout and fire-breathing, reflecting regional artistic traditions. The creature's presence on shields and banners did not always signify evil, because symbolism shifted depending on context and intention. In England and Wales, the red dragon became a sign of sovereignty and historical identity rather than moral warning. Scandinavian carvings preserved older serpent motifs on ship prows and wooden structures, blending pre-Christian imagery with later religious themes. These dragon heads served both decorative and protective roles, believed to ward off malevolent forces during travel. Medieval bestiaries illustrated dragons alongside lions and unicorns, placing them within a broader symbolic framework that connected animals to human virtues and flaws. The visual consistency of dragon forms reveals how artists relied on inherited patterns rather than direct observation. Manuscript margins often contain playful or exaggerated dragons, reflecting the freedom artists exercised within otherwise strict religious texts. Such marginalia suggests that dragons also served as expressions of imagination within disciplined monastic environments. Stained glass windows depicted dragon battles using color and light to emphasize moral transformation rather than physical violence. The positioning of dragons near scenes of judgment or temptation reinforced their association with spiritual testing. In some churches, dragon imagery appeared beneath the feet of archangels, symbolizing divine order prevailing over chaos. Artists carefully balanced fearsome features with elegance, ensuring that dragons remained visually compelling rather than purely terrifying. The spread of dragon imagery across Europe demonstrates how visual storytelling transcended language barriers in a largely illiterate society. Pilgrims traveling between regions carried memories of these images, contributing to the widespread recognition of dragon symbolism. Medieval festivals sometimes included dragon effigies paraded through streets, blending religious narrative with communal celebration. These performances reinforced shared values by transforming abstract lessons into tangible experiences. Dragons carved into architectural details also reflected the medieval fascination with boundaries between sacred and profane spaces. By placing dragons at thresholds such as doorways and arches, artists visually marked the transition from chaos to order. The endurance of dragon imagery across centuries reveals its adaptability to changing political and religious contexts. Even as artistic styles evolved, the essential features of dragons remained recognizable, maintaining continuity across generations. The presence of dragons in both elite and popular art suggests that the symbol resonated deeply across social classes. Workshops producing manuscripts often reused dragon motifs, ensuring that imagery spread efficiently through copying and adaptation. Artists interpreted dragons creatively, sometimes giving them human-like expressions that hinted at moral complexity rather than simple evil. These variations demonstrate that medieval audiences engaged actively with symbolism rather than accepting it passively. The visual culture of dragons reveals how deeply moral storytelling shaped the medieval imagination. Through sculpture, painting, and architecture, dragons became part of the physical environment, reinforcing lessons about discipline and faith. The creature's persistence in art reflects a belief that visual reminders could guide behavior as effectively as spoken sermons. Over time, dragon imagery evolved from purely religious symbolism to a broader cultural icon associated with heroism and legend. Yet even in secular contexts, echoes of moral teaching remained embedded within the creature's form. The medieval dragon therefore existed simultaneously as decoration, warning, and identity marker across Europe. Examining these images reveals how art served as a bridge between theology and daily experience. Dragons carved into stone and painted onto parchment transformed abstract moral lessons into shapes that could be seen, remembered, and shared. Medieval theologians often describe dragons as visible representations of chaos, using the creature's form to illustrate spiritual dangers that could not be seen directly. Sermons delivered in churches across Europe linked dragons to biblical imagery, particularly the serpent of Eden and the apocalyptic dragon described in the Book of Revelation. These associations shaped how listeners understood adversity, encouraging them to interpret hardship as a form of divine testing rather than random misfortune. Preachers described dragons lurking at the edges of wilderness, symbolizing temptation that threatened to pull individuals away from moral order. The wilderness itself became a stage for a spiritual struggle, where hermits and saints encountered dragons as metaphors for inner conflict. Stories of saints confronting dragons reinforced the idea that faith provided protection against forces that appeared overwhelming. Medieval audiences did not necessarily believe every dragon story literally, yet they accepted the creature as a meaningful symbol embedded within their worldview. Dragons in sermons often represented pride, greed, or uncontrolled desire, reminding listeners that moral vigilance required constant effort. Artists illustrated these teachings by placing dragons near scenes of judgment, reinforcing the connection between sin and spiritual danger. The creature's association with fire symbolized destructive passion, reflecting theological concerns about uncontrolled emotion. Some writers describe dragons guarding treasure, using the image to criticize material greed and warn against attachment to wealth. Monastic texts interpreted dragon encounters as moments of transformation, where individuals confronted their weaknesses and emerged spiritually renewed. These narratives encouraged believers to view personal struggle as an opportunity for growth rather than punishment. The dragon's terrifying appearance made abstract moral concepts easier to understand for audiences unfamiliar with complex theological language. Preachers used vivid imagery to ensure that lessons remained memorable long after the sermon ended. The popularity of dragon symbolism demonstrates how storytelling functioned as a primary educational tool in medieval society. In some regions, dragons were linked to natural disasters such as floods or fires, reinforcing the belief that moral imbalance affected the physical world. Chroniclers described such events with language that blended environmental observation with spiritual interpretation. Pilgrimage sites sometimes included stories of dragons defeated by local saints, strengthening regional identity through shared narrative. These tales offered reassurance that divine order ultimately prevailed over chaos. The dragon's presence in religious festivals allowed communities to reenact moral lessons through performance and spectacle. Effigies carried through streets symbolized the defeat of sin, transforming theology into communal experience. Despite regional variations, the underlying message remained consistent, emphasizing humility, discipline, and faith as defenses against disorder. The dragon therefore became a unifying symbol that connected local traditions to broader Christian teaching. Medieval writers often describe dragons as cunning rather than purely violent, reflecting concerns about deception and hidden danger. This portrayal reinforced the idea that moral threats could appear attractive or subtle rather than obviously monstrous. Knights and saints confronting dragons embodied the virtues expected of believers, including patience, courage, and compassion. Some legends emphasized dialogue or prayer rather than combat, illustrating the possibility of redemption even for symbolic monsters. These variations reveal that dragon imagery remained flexible, adapting to different teaching goals across Europe. The creature's association with darkness and caves symbolized the unknown aspects of human nature that required reflection and discipline. Monks copying manuscripts preserved these stories carefully, ensuring that moral symbolism reached future generations. Over time, the dragon became inseparable from medieval ideas about sin and spiritual testing. The consistency of this symbolism across regions demonstrates how theology shaped cultural imagination. Even when dragons appeared in secular stories, echoes of moral teaching continued to influence their portrayal. The creature's enduring presence in European culture reflects its effectiveness as a tool for communicating complex ethical ideas. By transforming invisible struggles into visible narratives, dragon stories allowed communities to confront fear collectively. These tales encouraged listeners to see challenges as opportunities for faith rather than sources of despair. The dragon's defeat symbolized restoration of balance, reinforcing hope that order could return even after chaos. Understanding the moral role of dragons reveals how medieval society interpreted the world through layered symbolism rather than literal explanation alone. In sermons, stories, and art, dragons became living warnings drawn into history, reminding people that the greatest battles often occurred within the human heart. By the later medieval period, dragons existed in a space between belief and interpretation, where people neither treated them purely as literal animals nor dismissed them entirely as fiction. Scholars writing in monasteries attempted to reconcile dragon imagery with emerging natural philosophy, suggesting that unusual creatures might belong to hidden corners of the world. Bestiary writers describe dragons alongside known animals, blending inherited symbolism with attempts to classify nature systematically. Some medieval thinkers proposed that dragons were exaggerated accounts of large serpents or distant exotic animals encountered through trade and travel. Merchants returning from Africa or Asia sometimes displayed unfamiliar skins or bones that reinforced the plausibility of dragon stories among European audiences. Fossils uncovered in fields or caves were occasionally interpreted as remnants of ancient beasts, strengthening the impression that dragons might once have existed physically. Chroniclers described fiery comets or atmospheric phenomena using dragon imagery, revealing how natural events were filtered through symbolic language. This blending of observation and allegory reflects a worldview in which science and spirituality were not yet fully separated. Medieval physicians sometimes referenced dragons in medical texts, using the creature as a metaphor for disease or imbalance within the body. The dragon's adaptability allowed it to function simultaneously as a natural curiosity and a moral symbol. Travelers' tales expanded European imagination, introducing descriptions of crocodiles or large reptiles that resembled traditional dragon imagery. These accounts blurred the boundary between myth and geography, encouraging readers to believe that dragons might inhabit distant lands beyond familiar borders. Mapmakers placed dragons in unexplored regions, not only as warnings but also as acknowledgments of uncertainty about the wider world. The phrase "here be dragons" reflects this tradition of marking unknown territory with symbolic creatures rather than precise information. Artists continued to depict dragons with consistent features, reinforcing shared expectations even as intellectual attitudes evolved. Courtly literature began to portray dragons with greater narrative complexity, sometimes presenting them as guardians rather than purely destructive beings. This shift suggests that audiences were exploring new interpretations of the creature while retaining its symbolic power. Alchemical texts incorporated dragon imagery to represent transformation, using the creature to illustrate processes of change and purification. In this context, the dragon symbolized both danger and potential, reflecting the dual nature of medieval philosophical thought. The growth of universities introduced new approaches to knowledge that encouraged debate about the nature of mythical creatures. Some scholars argued that dragons belonged to the realm of allegory, while others maintained that unknown species might exist beyond Europe's horizon. These debates reveal how medieval society navigated the tension between inherited belief and emerging curiosity about the natural world. Popular audiences continued to enjoy dragon stories regardless of scholarly disagreement, demonstrating the creature's enduring appeal. Festivals and performances featuring dragons allowed communities to engage with symbolism through shared experience rather than intellectual argument. Over time, dragon imagery became less associated with immediate fear and more with cultural identity and artistic tradition. Heraldic dragons appeared on coats of arms, blending legendary symbolism with expressions of political power. The persistence of dragon stories reflects humanity's desire to give shape to the unknown, especially during periods of rapid change. As exploration expanded during the late medieval era, reports of exotic animals challenged traditional interpretations without fully replacing them. The dragon remained a bridge between worlds, connecting imagination, faith, and observation. Writers began to treat dragons as part of a historical imagination shaped by earlier centuries, even as skepticism slowly grew. Yet skepticism did not erase the creature's significance, because dragons continued to convey moral and cultural meaning. The gradual shift from literal belief to symbolic interpretation reveals how medieval thought evolved without abandoning tradition entirely. Dragons in this period illustrate the complexity of a society negotiating between inherited stories and new forms of knowledge. Artistic depictions grew more stylized, emphasizing aesthetic beauty alongside narrative symbolism. The dragon's presence in literature and art allowed people to explore themes of transformation, danger, and redemption within a familiar framework. Even as natural philosophy advanced, the dragon endured as a cultural icon capable of adapting to new intellectual environments. The creature's survival through changing centuries demonstrates the power of symbols to outlast the beliefs that first shaped them. Medieval Europeans did not simply abandon dragons when knowledge changed, but reinterpreted them to fit evolving worldviews. This process reveals how history preserves imagination alongside fact, creating a layered understanding of the past. Between belief and observation, the medieval dragon remained a living symbol drawn into history as both warning and wonder. When we step back from medieval chronicles, carvings, and sermons, dragons begin to appear less like creatures wandering the landscape and more like mirrors reflecting how people understood danger, morality, and uncertainty. Across England, France, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia, the same shapes emerged repeatedly because they communicated lessons that transcended language and geography. Medieval societies lived in a world where spiritual meaning and physical reality were deeply intertwined, making symbolic creatures feel as present as storms or illness. Dragons gave form to invisible struggles, allowing communities to imagine sin, chaos, and temptation as something that could be seen, named, and confronted. The persistence of these stories reveals how deeply narrative shaped daily life, guiding behavior through images that felt both ancient and immediate. Knights and saints confronting dragons represented more than heroic combat, because audiences recognized the encounter as a reminder that discipline required constant effort. Artists carved dragons into stone and painted them onto parchment not simply to frighten viewers but to encourage reflection on the fragile balance between order and disorder. Chroniclers recording sightings of serpents or strange beasts captured a moment when observation and imagination blended into a single historical language. These accounts remind us that medieval history cannot be separated entirely from symbolism, because belief shaped how people interpreted every unfamiliar event. The dragon's endurance across centuries shows how powerfully a shared image can unite diversified cultures around common moral ideas. Even as knowledge changed and skepticism grew, the creature remained a familiar presence within European storytelling traditions. Over time, dragons shifted from warnings of immediate spiritual danger to broader cultural symbols connected to identity, legend, and imagination. Heraldic dragons carried meanings of courage and lineage, while festival dragons transformed moral lessons into communal celebration. The flexibility of the dragon allowed it to survive transitions from medieval theology to early modern curiosity about the natural world. By adapting to new contexts, the creature continued to speak to audiences who no longer believed in literal monsters, yet still recognized the power of its symbolism. Dragons became reminders that history is not only a record of events, but also a record of how people gave shape to fear and hope. In medieval Europe, the unknown was rarely empty, because imagination filled the gaps where certainty could not reach. The dragon stood at those boundaries, marking the edge between faith and doubt, wilderness and order, danger and transformation. Stories of dragon slaying offered reassurance that chaos could be faced without losing humanity's sense of purpose. These narratives encouraged listeners to see adversity as a test rather than an ending, reinforcing resilience during uncertain times. Through sermons, art, and literature, dragons became a language through which communities explored the deepest questions of existence. The creature's presence in sacred and secular spaces alike reveals how moral storytelling shaped every layer of medieval life. Even when dragons were no longer believed to exist physically, their symbolic power endured because the struggles they represented never disappeared. Modern audiences often view dragons as fantasy, yet their historical role reminds us that symbols once carried the weight of lived experience. Medieval people did not separate imagination from reality as sharply as later generations would, allowing dragons to exist in a meaningful middle ground. This perspective challenges us to reconsider how narratives shape our own understanding of danger and responsibility today. The dragon's image continues to appear in modern culture, echoing centuries of storytelling rooted in moral reflection. By tracing its journey through medieval Europe, we see how a single symbol can evolve without losing its core significance. The persistence of dragons suggests that humanity returns again and again to stories that transform fear into understanding. These creatures remind us that history is not only about what people saw, but about how they chose to interpret what they saw. Dragons were never just monsters lurking in caves or skies. but warnings drawn into history to guide communities through uncertainty. Their presence in art and narrative reveals the enduring human desire to make sense of the unknown through shared imagery. In listening to these stories today, we encounter echoes of a world where every struggle carried spiritual meaning and every victory promised restoration. The medieval dragon stands as a testament to the power of storytelling to shape memory long after belief changes. It invites us to consider how symbols carry truths that facts alone cannot fully express. Across centuries, dragons have remained companions to human imagination, reminding us that moral questions often outlive the cultures that first asked them. The stories carved into stone and written into chronicles continue to speak quietly about fear, courage, and the search for balance. Perhaps that is why dragons never truly vanished from history, because the lessons they carried remained relevant even as the world transformed. Thank you for spending time with a history where monsters were not only feared but understood as reflections of the human struggle for meaning. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this, quiet, reflective, and grounded in the ways people once understood the world, you're always welcome here.